11-page stories. Written through L.T. Zupan. Read by L.T. Zupan. Story number 2. Sigh. One dash dash dash. A tired reflection. So tired of even that. Too tired to close the doors that would shut out some of the many nuisances of life. Life. What a tired old rerun of a dead joke. Smith was his first name, arguably the most normal of American names, as a last name. Yet the excitement of it being his first name was what Smith got to carry around with him. Another false light to illuminate the fool's gold fossilized in every new cave he came to explore through the meanderings of his day-to-day existence. Smith walked down the sidewalk. He was in his decaying, formerly suburban neighborhood. It was now being slowly eaten into by industrial compounds and buildings that made glue for Connecticut, Velcro for Minnesota. Who knew if even that was accurate information? And who really cared? The question it always came back to, who cares? Or was it just a statement? The baby screams remind us how we are related to animals in some strange, long-forgotten way. As forgotten as Eden before organized religion existed. Smith knew the way around most any argument. Smith Roberts knew the way around his neighborhood as well. Oh, so very well. Lots of time and repetition had made that nice and easy. Tracks laden into his brain like a slow and deep train of pointless thought. Smith got to the first of several flat red stop signs. He stopped. A beige Jeep turned right in front of him. He continued. He lit his hand-rolled cigarette and kept walking. He got to the building he'd been after and walked into its parking lot. It was a large building, partially broken down. He walked into an alley sort of opening, down an outer corridor and into a final opening in the center of the property. There stood 3 rusty chairs with broken white plastic seats and backings. He sat down and pushed his light brown and peppered white hair back along the contours of his head. A woman and her average-sized dog, out on the sidewalk, strolled across the perimeter of the building's lot. She was well beyond the mouth of the alleyway's opening. Smith sighed. He began rolling another smoke. A ray of sunlight gasped through the near-constant cloud cover of his little microclimate pocket of Massachusetts, where Smith's family used to live. Now it was just him. They had all died by choice, slowly, in their own minds. He was sure they would state that sad fact another way, if they were alive enough to even face the discomfort of discussing awkward topics, let alone bringing them up. But alas, they all may as well be dead. The topic truly wasn't even worth thinking about, but try telling that to the human brain. A device that never seems to care if its inhabitant wants to spend time on the thoughts it focuses on time and time again, generating a certain form of tiredness and irritability at first, a certain level of tolerability, at least at first, and then a tiredness well beyond, tiredness perhaps worse than most anything, bad enough to not have anything beyond it possible to say. He lit it. The sun fluttered away, back and away again, probably to be gone for at least another 20 minutes. It was a rather beautiful visual effect. Rather beautiful. He continued to sit. The gray ground was textured with slightly moist dirt and asphalty bumpiness, so common in any given city. A ladybug so old it was nearly overtaken by its black spot's blackness crawled about. It was unable to fold its wings properly back into its wing shells, whatever you really call those wing shells. Smith intended to never know. As glossy as they were, as M&M-like as they may be, at least he could smoke most anywhere he wanted to in his life, Smith thought. Smith pushed the thoughts of his family as far out of his mind as they would go. Again, for the 980,000th time this year, he sighed and leaned back. Well, what to do now, huh? I hate February, Smith said aloud to the no one. Smith was a decent fellow, not particularly overly oriented towards one emotion, such as hate or sadness. In fact, he could probably convince you of the greatness of February, if he had the will to, and he could do this while freezing his ass off amongst a group of peers lost in the throes of weather completion. Big deal, he would have told you, but today it was an unseasonably warm February day. In fact, what he was truly tired of, at that moment at least, was being siphoned or vortexed into speaking aloud that he hated February. When really it was more the general grayness outside he didn't like, followed by the thoughts of hating or being mildly bothered by but not really caring about, finding himself speaking aloud to himself, followed by the inevitable stepping back, which always came next in his mental processes or sequences, thereby where he would then see the greater context or picture of the dialogue of his self and his mind, and be annoyed by the time he had just spent on more nothingness. And finally, his helplessness to stop all of this. All he could do is hope it would be slightly better the next time it happened, which of course it never really was. And all of that he already knew. And that took him to a place which had become, after a decade now, unutterably tired. He stood up and started walking home to ... His house was small, smaller than most of the others around it, and his paint was tan and peeling, but who cared? He walked in through his side door and turned to survey his dining room and his kitchen. He hung his coat up, dead-bolted the door, and walked through a short hallway to sit on a couch. He still had his generic Mountain Dew, Moon Dew it was, and was wearing different shades of darker brown clothing. His couch was made of a fine black fake leather. He sat down and emptied the rolling tobacco and its paraphernalia onto the coffee table from his pockets. It was only a few years earlier, when he had begun to realize sorrow was actually one of the many emotions or states that one is really very lucky to be allowed to experience. There were, after all, much, much worse realities out there. In this strange carnival everyone accepts as reality, much worse. And so began an entrance to, and hopefully usually a quick exit from, realms Smith enjoyed completely avoiding. Endless and painful was basically what he had found those various realms to be, all be them coupled with several other debatedly valuable qualities, to say the least. He sighed again, time to roll another smoke. He thought about his possibilities for the very near future. Obviously, there was always pornography, wasn't there always, tactless as it was. Media, there was always media too. Be it movies, shows, comic books, audio poetry books, documentaries, interviews, educational YouTube videos, music, concerts, music in general, Wikipedia, political Twitter, the Facebook, the internet, Google, etc. Being creative, there was always that too. Drawing a sketch, writing a poem, etc. People, well, there weren't people as of late. People had become a sort of a letdown, a topic that invoked annoyance, frustration, sorrow, and ultimately tiredness rather quick. What else? Altering his mind with the only substance he had then believed to be still almost worth a damn, alcohol. Specifically, cheap beer. Not bad beer, but fairly cheap beer. He just didn't have the concern anymore these days to drink whiskey and get loud and wild, to deal with those repercussions. Was that it? Yup, he had gone through his entire inventory. No, wait, he could go out again. Maybe to a stupid-ass, cool, but overall unrewarding coffee shop. Overall unfair is more like it. Or later, the nightlife, as Americans like to call it. There. Now his inventorying was complete. And he could always go through the torture of doing nothing. There was always that. He craned his head and looked upward. Another sigh emoted, unnoticed by Smith. His sadness was worse than sadness, but definitely a form of pain. Probably not much worse than extreme pain. It was 6 p.m., 6:14 p.m. to be precise. 3 dash dash dash. He woke up at some point while lying in bed. Smith had shifted from complete asleepness consciousness on his bed in his bedroom to a sporadical lucidity, awakening gradually unto himself. Slowly, Smith became aware that he was, in bursts, aware. This happened most every wake time for him, an immemorially repeated ritual, stale long enough that the word stale had peeled away from its application to the situation and had simply fallen off. As usual, with the orange peels of waking upness bursting intermittently in, came something like a freshness or a hopefulness. Anywhere from 5 minutes to 4 hours it would last, usually closer to 40 minutes, before wearing off to get replaced by the realization that even though, yes, it was another day, that didn't really mean anything good. Life really wasn't any different than the point in time he had left off from, where he had given in to falling asleep, as they call it. 4 dash dash dash. He leaned back in the bathtub. This was one of those events in daily life which still managed to wash his consciousness momentarily away. He released a massive breath outwards. Sometimes, about a third of the time, if he timed it just right, his whole self would just kind of give out for a moment after that release. Well, longer than a moment even, a small bit longer. His daughter had died in the womb. Selah would have been her name. It would have been too bright a life for this world. No one understood that. Not even her mother, but Smith did. Not that that made any fucking bit of a difference. Smith depressed the water-draining drain button. 19 minutes later, he towel-dried off, put on his robe, and sat back down on a couch. He contemplated the legal structure of contemporary America. He thought about how he didn't give a fuck that he couldn't even express certain things in his creative works because freedom of speech was a far cry from a real thing. A far cry which became a fading echo in a long hallway specifically designed to absorb sound. Merely because most humans were robots, which were surprised Smith wasn't just so happy because he knew enough in life to manage to drive a vehicle down the road to get a fucking double bacon cheeseburger with barbecue sauce and onion rings on it. 5 dash dash dash. He parked his car in the half-snotty independent coffee shop parking lot, keeping his windows all the way up. Smith needed a little time until he would be willing to hear the brash, heartless conversations of the average man and woman, caffeinated, redundant, and on their usual chases or games. He tried not to think of all the horror in the universe that could make him grateful to be able to peacefully drink a cup of hot coffee. Another pointless, painful, and played-out sequence, one of the many spaces he had already embraced, explored, and tried nobly to offer out a fix for thousands of times over. Now he didn't even go there, and could thankfully see it coming miles away. He walked in and was given a few seconds to survey the insides of the coffee house, before it would unconsciously be considered by others as slightly odd to continue to look around. Also, he had to do just a few slow head turns back and forth, kind of a mild and broad surveillance that lasts only a second or three. The slow back and forth sweeping couldn't be too slow of a sweep. If it was incredibly slow, quite like a meditation, that would be unsettling. No one likes anything publicly too meditative. Freaks him out a little bit. He approached the register and was greeted with the standard, "How are you?" "I'm great," he said. "How are you?" "I'm good." "Awesome." Sigh. Another wasted fucking day. Memories he had that he knew he could never, ever, ever, ever compete with ever again. And to make things worse, it could always be worse. Sigh. 6 dash dash dash. He drove around the corner with a takeaway cup of coffee firmly implanted in the cup holder. It was difficult to completely stop at every stop sign, but he tried to remind himself to do just so. The sky was a dark blue-gray. The grass on his lawn was dead as he pulled in, just the way he liked it. Who had invented lawns anyways? He would never know or care. Smith closed his door and made his car sputter its little alarm honk via the remote in his hand. He slid the key fob into his fifth pocket after entering his home, along with its 2 keys on a ring. He sat down and loosened his belt. Yes, he might jerk off, as they call it, later in that night. Pretty exciting. He stared at the wall, then pulled out his rollies and prepared a cigarette. He grabbed the glass octagonal ashtray by its corner and slid it slowly towards him. The wood grain of the coffee table was a boring shade, as were the shapes it made within itself. The texture of its surface was broken by many wearings down and even little craters and divots from some careless previous owners. "Were I a carpenter," Smith spoke aloud, "I could sand or lacquer or both or some kind of things. Whatever. Fuck cares." Smith tried to recreate the magic and alchemy that frequently arises from the marriage of coffee and cigarettes. He had an almost conscious thought that he wouldn't quite successfully accomplish this today, at least not in any meaningful measure or quantity. But he would try. A small, foul odor was probably underneath everything. Someone probably was dying somewhere within a 250-mile radius. Someone else is probably also living out the life he should have been awarded. What with all of his contribution? He exhaled and watched the classic plume tendrils drift from the side stream smoke of his cigarette's body. He deliberately smacked his smoke one time against the molded groove in the corner of the ashtray. The ash quickly was detached. It slowly settled in the tray. He had said, "This is my son," proudly. But he knew no one would hear it. It was too late by then. Always too late. He put his fucking cigarette's bright cherry out into the beautiful rigid glass, full of sadness. Sad that kindness would never find an audience with the majority. 7 dash dash dash. Smith never understood Tetris, or rather how Tetris had meant so much to so many. He was out walking again, back to his favorite little local spot. There was something 10 degrees quieter than a shuffle in his step today. He would probably go out drinking tonight, and it would probably be pointless by the time it was over. Pretty exciting. He reached that same alley entry point and started walking through it. Someone had marked the spaces between the bricks with some kind of black eons ago, and he had begun to notice it each time he arrived out here, a little more of it each time. Now, he thought, the last of it was mapped out, almost like a digital brain in appearance, he thought, mixed with some kind of 80s arcade game like Brickles, or maybe even Pong. It was merely 4 p.m. now, and he had a few hours to kill before going out. Maybe he would write a poem or two when he got back to his house. something without a predicate. He plopped down in one of the half-broken old white chairs and lit his smoke. The sun was out, and the day was bright, thankfully. He almost felt good, or whatever the memory of that emotion is. He thought he was supposed to be grateful about that. He exhaled. A tiny little inchworm, caterpillar-looking thing was making its way from the corner of the cubic inlet to who knew where. Probably another corner without its knowing. Another lost animal, clumsily reacting to the effects of human beings. Broken because of our extreme intelligence. At least extreme in one or two senses, that is. It reached a rusty nail whose wide base was blackening near the ground. Its front arms gripped onto the nail as it landed its body downward. It sprung back up off the nail, hovered around as if in postulation, then landed gripped back down onto it again. Finally, the tiny little creature decided this wasn't the right time or the right object to proceed with. It backed off and landed on the ground and waited, presumably until another idea struck. Too tired, likely from a lack of food, to get out of its stranded mess in a continuous series of actions. So, better to just wait a moment. Think this one through, as it were. It slowly turned and went back from whence it came. Smith had tuned out of this a little while ago. From time to time he did check back in on his little friend, however. He was wearing mainly blacks and grays today. Where would he go out to tonight? He thought, not that I care. 8... Smith remembered the dirty little ladybug on the blacktop gritty ground that had been around. So insignificant that insect is. Worth ignoring those devices those who use to ignore with, or paying that attention to update humanity with. The maelstrom will never reconcile itself to the losing end, some sad souls always knew. And the so-called ladybug's tiny black legs with all their follicles protrusive, walking against the surrounding air's pressure. Walking and moving so as to walk against all circumstances say so. One leg slowly pressurized forward from a ladybug brain signal to another leg's movement forward. How many legs does a ladybug even have? Probably less than the clumps of drying dirt lying around it, upon which it gathers traction to scale forward with. Ignorant of the hopefulness the dirt might have in its strange, ununderstood, supposedly unsentient plan. No collective dirt mind out there, right? Well, at least according to the ladybug's relentless pursuits. If a crumb of black chunky dirt became dislodged or crushed under a so-called ladybug's foot or mandible, well, so be it. It was just a clump of dirt, unworthy of our important attention. Our attention, as humans, is probably important enough for each other. Unless our phones fuck that up for the sad majority enslaved to them these days, as it is fondly called. But certainly not for a clump of dirt. A writer would certainly be delinquent to stop and pause. To look at his keyboard while he typed for the audience he was a half-servitor of. Pause. And think of what the sound of his fingertips hitting the keyboard reminded him of. To trance out on the shapes of the reflections of light on the key squares of the keyboard. And on the ladybug's trundle, the automation of the insect's pursuits, the feel of the clumps of dirt as Smith Roberts took a few granules of soil and reduced them to a smear on his fingertip, and the ugliness he felt about that smear. Absolutely delinquent. All we have is our rushed purposes, you know. Defense of that fact is quite more than violent, obviously. Well, all I can say is, as the weak narrator reflector, The one thing I know is that Smith went to sleep then and there, thinking of the blacktop's textured poetic description, and dreamt of nothing, of course. Nothing to owe and nothing to love him. 9 ... Well, that was a pointless night out, Smith said to himself out loud. Oh well, he thought out loud to himself. They had brutally, physically, and sexually tortured him for over 4 years. Just for fun. No one seemed to understand that. But when you have Forever 21 and Banana Republic, why would you ever even face that? No. The closest we could ever get to that publicly, obviously, would be little fucking moments in various movies and POWMIA flags given at least some measure of respect. Donald Trump and other fearless leaders saying, "We will never forget." But when it came to Smith Roberts' position, people never even really looked in the first place, you know. All it took was a couple of key words. People were quick to shut off their childish fucking know-it-all minds and shut him out. But whatever. Smith had had way more than enough time to get used to it, you know. In fact, Smith really didn't care anymore. He spent most of his time thinking about other things. I mean, really, he would say, why would you waste your time on such disgusting, repetitive subjects? 10 ... Smith could tell he had something to offer to the world, something it really had no concept of. Yet, he was forever constrained by his unfreedom of expression, so those who would receive such a gift or offering from him, perhaps through some kind of creative expression, perhaps right now, were doomed to never really receive the gift. Fear. The ultimate limiter. Excuses. The ultimate justification for limiting and hurting another. A fact that never hits home, as they say, until a gift or something fearmongers would receive is blocked. Then, those who are run by fear realize, oh shit, I just lost out on something precious. Well, Mr. Smith Roberts really just can't give a shit at that point. That point that arrived so very long ago. Well, now can he? Still, of course, he would hold out, as long as humanly possible, for love. He would hold out for love, and wade through the rest of Earth, with all of its magnetic, poorly disguised, and self-important vortices.